Okay. You guys see the screen, right? Just making sure. Okay, great. Okay, yeah, so hello everyone. Yes, this is the first front end lesson. So hope you guys are excited to learn React, because React is like a really popular kind of tool and language that a lot of companies use. It was first created by Facebook, but literally like I've seen like most companies use React. The alternatives are like Angular and Vue, but I would say by far most companies use React. So yes, so what is React? Okay, so React is basically a library that helps you run JavaScript in a much more a way that's focused on components. So if you guys already like learned like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but with that, it's often like very hard to separate by components. Like oftentimes you'll see you have like a really fat long page, and that's not really like organized for one. And also like personal opinion, using like the DOM, like using the .get like get element by ID, I feel like I don't think it's personal opinion. Everyone thinks it's kind of annoying, like having to like click on, like having to find the tag and like use like click and all these bunch of methods that you have to like search up the name for and stuff. That's honestly like a lot of work, and it's not very organized. So like React basically helps you have a much more efficient and flexible way of kind of organizing your code. Yeah, so like I said, it's really based on the idea of components. So I kind of just want to like show you just a kind of perhaps like an idea of how a website is separated by components. So if you look at like, for example, like the Facebook feed or something, you'll see that the website is split into many different things. There's the actual feed, there's a nav bar, there's like the sidebars in which you have like recommended things or like groups that you're in and stuff. All of those are different components. So for example, if we were to go to a bunch of different pages, all of those different pages are going to have the same nav bar. So instead of like rewriting the nav bar over and over again, if we just have one component we call nav bar, we can actually just use that component over and over again. And that is basically going to help us keep our code a lot more organized, not have to use a lot of space and like time to like create like a lot of repeating code. So that's like the basis of why React is very important. Okay. This is pretty much what I said. More readable. It also has a lot of boilerplate coding, kind of basically like templates, like the initial templates kind of laid out for you, which I'll show you a little bit how like the initial kind of app looks like at first. But yeah, that is definitely something that really helps coders like have a lot easier time, honestly. Yeah, okay, so let's get on to like actually installing it. So I'm not really sure if like you guys already installed Node, but if you guys haven't yet, I'm sure like all the installation kind of like keywords are on the Notion page. But yeah, so if you guys haven't, I'll give like a second or so after I'm showing you a little bit how the how like the commands work. But yeah, I'll definitely give a little bit of time to show you that afterwards. Okay, so let me first show you guys like how to first start up a React app. So I'm going to just like, for example, oh, my internet. Okay, for example, I'm going to first just make a new folder. I'm just going to call this like front end React, and then go inside this. And within this folder, I'm going to use this command. So honestly, I forget the name of it sometimes, so I'm just going to scroll it back up, but it's npx create-react-app. So you guys can try if you want to follow along.
Really muted.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. My internet just cut off. Okay, but yeah, I'll definitely explain again, I think I was just talking about like how to start your first like React app, like how to create like the boilerplate that I was talking about. So to do that, you can just do this in any folder, type in npx create-react-app. And this is basically a command that tells your computer to start the whole React app. So it's kind of like a misconception that React is just like one file, but it's actually a tons of dependencies within this. So this command kind of like creates all the dependencies for you, so you don't have to worry about coding all that yourself. And after that, you can just type like whatever you want your app to be called, which I'm just going to call React lesson. I'll call it React lesson. Okay. Yeah, I think if you're using it for the first time, you might have to install it first, which I'm not sure. It might be in the Notion or like, yeah, I think it could be in the Notion, like how to install it. Like I don't remember the exact command because I like installed it a while ago, but I think, yeah, definitely maybe try. Yeah, thanks. I think Gabe wrote like on Mac, brew install node. Yeah, I think there's descriptions for both Windows and Mac on the Notion. I can give you guys, I can pause for a little bit, and this honestly takes like forever to load. So I'm gonna just like pause the recording and you guys can like do that for like 5 minutes or so. Okay, so now that we got hopefully some people to install Node, which you guys can find on this Notion right over here. So to actually start your app, there's a command called npm start. Actually, I think I forgot to mention, let's take a look at the file structure first. So ls lets you look at the file structure. So we're going to see that this is our app that we called it earlier, that this is what I wanted to call the app. So to go into it, just like use your regular old terminal tools. And then we can see that this is the file structure of it. Now that we actually entered into the file, we can actually start the app using npm start. So it also takes like a hot second for it to start. Okay, I'm going to also pause the record. Okay, so now that our app has started, we can take a look at, this is kind of like the initial kind of thing it kind of starts off with. But let's take a look at our actual like code structure. So this is when you're starting like local build. So this is kind of only on your machine basically. So we haven't actually pushed it to like GitHub or anything. So this is straight up on your local machine. So to actually quit this, I think on Mac it's Command C. Yeah, no, Control C. So that's how you get out of the local host running. So let's go ahead and just like pull up our code on whatever code editor you're using. I'm going to use VS Code because I think that is the most efficient for running like React and stuff. All right, so, okay, sorry, it says my internet connection is unstable. So if I ever like freeze, let me know. But okay, so let's take a look at the file structure first. So if we take a look, we have source file, which has app.css, app.js. The most important things that you need to know is app.js. And it is taking a second to load, but this is how it looks like in general. And also index.js. So whenever you, oh my goodness, sorry for my horrible internet connection. Okay, hopefully I'm back. Okay, yeah, let me know if I freeze. I'll fix that if that happens. Okay, let me share again. Okay, so as I was saying, the most important files you need to know are index.js and app.js for the initial boilerplate. So index.js is kind of what the application first reads when you first run your React app. It first reads index.js. So if you look at this file more in depth, you're going to see react.strict mode app, react.strict mode, and all of this is dot rendered through the React DOM. So what do all of these kind of mean? So basically, React has like a virtual DOM. So instead of needing to write all the JavaScript DOM functions that you learned in the JavaScript lecture, it kind of has a lot of like dependencies and stuff that kind of make it automatic. So that's basically what React DOM is doing. React.strict mode, not super important, but it's just making sure that there's a lot of versions of React, and it's just making sure like if you use any like commands that like the previous versions used, it will like throw an error. Okay, and if you take a look at document.getElementById, this is actually a regular old vanilla JavaScript, and you're going to see that it takes the root. So what this root is coming from is actually from index.html. So we do actually have an HTML file here. As you can see, this is our only HTML file. So this is like you still need some plain old HTML in any website. And what the get element by ID root is doing is getting the roots from this HTML. Just like what we taught you before, just like when you get element by ID, you can take the ID and put that into the function name, and that's gonna basically insert everything into this div. All right, so basically our structure of this code is going to insert everything into the HTML of index.html. Now let's look at what app is. So app is actually imported up here. You might be wondering why it's in a tag. That's because React lets us have like custom tags, and I'll talk more about that later. Let me double check if there's any questions. Okay, no questions. All right. But for now, I'm going to first show you how the app.js file looks like. So this is a typical app.js. This is what they first give you. As you can see, like this is kind of what's displayed here. So learn React is shown over here, edit source, all of that is right here. So this is what's being displayed. Yeah, so this is kind of basically the thing that's being inserted into your index.js. Let's take a look at what other files there are. Package.json might be a good thing to also mention. This is just a file that oftentimes when you're downloading like packages and stuff, it will fall into your dependencies. So dependencies can include stuff like Bootstrap. If you're adding like font libraries and stuff, it can also go into your dependencies. Scripts, this is kind of just like for your terminal commands that help that. So like start is what we use when we do npm start. Build is for when you're actually like putting into a website into like production. Test is if you're writing tests, which I rarely people do. But maybe if you're not lazy, you'll write tests. Eject is just don't ever use it. Never used it before, but I don't think good things happen when you use it. And these stuff are not as important. They're just, yeah, just random things. Also, something else to point out is node modules. So node modules is also something that you tend to just ignore. These are also all the dependencies that are downloaded with React. So these are kind of actually what is making React in the background. So as you can see, there's a bajillion of them. So you never actually have to look at them. Just kind of ignore them. Actually, when you push, this is actually being ignored. This is in your .git ignore, which is like basically all the files that you're ignoring. So yeah, do we have any questions so far? Let's see. Okay, I think we are good to continue. All right. Okay, so let's start actually writing some code now. All right, so if we create, let's first create like the nav bar. I think that's a really common component in all websites. So kind of like what I mentioned before, nav bar would be its own component. So what I mean by that is kind of, it will be its own file. So, okay, I'll first write like a nav bar dot like JS. So oftentimes, just to give you an idea of how a website is broken down, there's a lot of different ways, but I feel like the most common ways is by components and then also by pages. So oftentimes people will create like a components folder where they'll put all the components within them, and also a pages folder, which every single page that you see in a website would be its own folder as well. So yeah, but for now, because we're making a really, really simple component, I'm not going to put it into this folder. I'm just going to put it out here in source. Okay, so if we want to write our first components, first thing we got to do is import React. So the command to do that, I believe, is import React from React. And just like that. Okay, so after you do that, let's create our first function name. So let's call it navbar. Usually it's like the exact same name as what you name your file. And we're going to set this to have an arrow function. Any questions so far? And basically, if you want to export anything, the phrase to do that is export default, and then whatever the name of your function is. So basically what default is if you have like it's like kind of like the main function that you're kind of like exporting. So most of the time, if you just have one function in here, you'll be export defaulting that name of your function. Okay, so let's go ahead and just show you a little bit. React is really confusing because there's a lot of syntax things going on, but there has to be a return. And this is kind of where your JSX is held. So JSX is kind of like a mix of JavaScript and HTML. So that's all going to be held within your return. Okay, so let's just kind of make our nav bar have like a really typical phrase. Let's just call it hello world, because I can't think of anything else. And let's save that. Okay, now to actually import this into our app, we actually have to write this down somewhere, right? So to kind of show you how to do that, just basically you have to write an import statement. So write import navbar from wherever your thing is from, which ours is write the same file level navbar. So now we imported, but we haven't actually used it within our app yet. So to do that, let's just go ahead and write that in. So let's just do right here, nav bar. And you could also close your tag, but actually a shorter way that most people do it is just like this. Do we have any questions so far? Wait, so the syntax is both HTML and Java. Yeah, so it's a little bit confusing, and honestly, like all the time, like I like forget to like wrap things in curly braces and stuff. But if you take a look, everything that we write that's not in curly braces is kind of just displayed as plain text. So this is just like your regular old HTML. But if you do put something inside like curly brackets, which I'll show more examples of later, it will actually render that logic. So that's like usually your JavaScript goes inside there. Yeah, I'll definitely show more examples of those later. Yeah, okay. So for example, now we put our nav bar out. So as you can see, we actually have our nav bar here. So yay. That is just how you can import. Yeah, let me think of what's the next way to go about. Let's see. Okay, so something else I think is good to mention. You can, let me show an example of like you're using a curly bracket. So for example, let's put in here, let's x equals 5. And then let's change it later to be like 10, just so we can see it's being updated. If we want to actually put x here, oh, let's put this in a paragraph tag. So if we want to actually put x here, if we put x like this is going to show x and not 10 as we want. So instead, we're going to put this into curly brackets. And now we're going to see that 10 is displayed. So that's just one example. Something else that I think is really good to mention, you can pass in props into your components. So for example, if I want to say title, we can set title to be, let's just say, let's say oranges. Okay. Inside of our nav bar, we can actually let me first show. We can actually use a prop. So basically what a prop is an object. So let's use an example of actually printing out this object. So since we used title here, you have to use .title to call on that specific object. So as you can see, already updated in the back, but it changed to oranges because that's what we passed inside here. Something else that I want to mention is called object destructuring. So a lot of the times, if you don't want to write props dot everything, because it can get kind of like just annoying to write props dot every single time, you can actually use something called destructuring. So instead, it'll just be like this, put it into curly brackets. If you actually have like two props, like for example, you might have something here also, then you can just use a comma and then put whatever that is. But make sure that the thing that you put up here is matching the name that you also put in the other function. And then instead of props, you can just do title. And I think that should also work. Yeah, that also works. Yeah. Do we have any questions so far? Yeah, I know this is like pretty new compared to like the things we've been teaching so far. So if you have any like questions at all, even if you think they're dumb, like I could try my best to answer them. Okay, so someone asked to repeat the last part again about being able to not use props. So yeah, if you don't want to use props up here like that, because this would involve having to do props.title. If you have like a ton of props, like maybe doing props at description, all of that, it can be like very lengthy in terms of just writing. So a lot of what people like to do is just to do object destructuring. So basically you put that into like curly brackets, and then you don't need to use props dot anymore. Did that answer your question? Yeah, you can have multiple props. So just like you can have, for example, description up here. Let's actually try to just like play around with this a little bit. So maybe let me say, let this equal yummy. And then inside here, I can just say description equal disk. And then up inside my nav bar, I can print this out, and hopefully this works. Oops, okay. Description. Yeah, so it's gonna kind of just print it out instead of you having to write prop stop every time. Yeah, so you would incorporate CSS the same way. Like it's CSS hasn't changed much. To keep your code organized, I think just good common practices is often to put your JS and your CSS into like one folder called navbar instead of having like duplicates all over the place, like navbar.js and then navbar.css. So a lot of people like to put like both of those files within one file folder called navbar. So it's a huge structure of codes within your source. Yeah, no problem. Okay. So now I want to do something a little bit more like logic behind it. This is like a very standard example that people do. So let's create a counter. So every time we click on a button, let's make the button called like increase number and like a number and another button called decrease number. Every time we click on that button, I want our number to increase or decrease. Yeah, so since we have a different component we want to create, let's go ahead and create a different file. And once again, import React from React. All right, and let's go ahead and write our function. Always make sure to export default it. Okay. I think something, okay, I'll mention that later. Okay. Let's see. So basically something else that I need to talk about a little bit. I think I'm going to transition over to the slides again. But for our counter, we're going to have to keep updating our variable, right? If we like press increase number, we're going to have to increase that number a lot. So every time we want to change some variable, we actually need to use something called state. And state is definitely right now, we're just going to have like intro to it. We're going to talk more about state next week as well, because it's a very, very complicated topic. But for now, I'm just going to give like a quick intro to it. And I have more slides for this as well. So I'm going to just present. Okay, so state is basically, the official textbook definition is very confusing. It's like a JavaScript object that stores a component's dynamic data, determines the component's behavior. So what that means is basically, it keeps like a snapshot of what your variable is at a certain time, because your variable is continuing to change all the time. And React really focuses on the idea of re-rendering. So anytime your state is being changed, or if your prop is being changed, React is going to re-render. And what I mean by re-render is basically go through your entire code again. And it's also going to preserve the state between the renders as well. So kind of just like the differences between props and state. Props is always used for like passing down, versus state is like editing within the function itself. And props are also immutable, versus state is often you're supposed to be changing it. Like that's kind of the purpose. And state uses a hook. So I'm going to talk about hooks more in the next slide. So there's actually tons of hooks out there. There's like use hook, use effect, use ref, use reducer. We're only going to talk about use state today, because that's like the most prevalent one that you use the most. So use state basically allows us to store and manipulate state individually. So it kind of returns two values, the current state and a function to update it. So that's why you'll see that there's actually two values put inside here. So the first value is the current state. So for example, if we set like, if we wanted to actually access the value of count or something, then count is what we want. But the value to the right is actually a function. So this function is what's used to update it. So as you can see in the example here, this is one way in which you can like update your original value. So you do set count plus 1. And something else that you should know is after using like a use state, the first value to the right here is your initial value. So this could be like an object, a Boolean, an integer, a string. In our case here, if we wanted to make the menu open or set menu false, set menu opened, we want to open or close it, right? So I guess initially we wanted it to be closed. So we'll just set it to false. And here, count and set count. So this is what we're gonna be using in our counter. We're gonna first set it equal to 0. And something you should keep in mind that you should never be modifying state like directly. So don't do like count plus equals 1 or something like that. That would not be good for your function. Always use your updating function. And it's always standard practice to use set. So whatever you call your first variable, just kind of put set in front of it. That's just like standard practice. Something else to also keep in mind is don't use state within conditional statements or nested functions. And this is just because React focuses a lot about order. And if there's like some times in which you have to create a new variable and sometimes you don't, it's gonna error. So just something you should always keep in mind. But you can always put set state within if statements or whatnot, don't like initialize new variables. So it's very often that you will be initializing new variables at the top of your function. This is another example. So just a quick example of like passing down props. We have like our locations here. And location is here, set location. We want to have the initial value of location to be set equal to this fat like array. So we're going to set that equal to our initial value. And you can actually pass down into your props both location and set locations. So this is just like one example. Okay, so now that I've taught state is a very, very confusing topic. So that was like a really, really brief overview, but do you guys have any questions so far? Okay. All right, I will move on to making the actual counter then. So the actual counter, we need a value that actually holds the number, right? So kind of like our slide example, instead of using count, let's just call our number. Always have your updating function right next to it. And we're going to set the first value to be 0. Something else to note is that you always have to import useState. So I believe you can import in the same line. So let's just go ahead and import that. Okay, so now let's begin to write our actual function. So within our return, we want to be able to, something else that I should mention, all your return should be within one div. If you write something outside of the div, it's going to error. That's just the way React works. So make sure you always write like everything inside one big fat div. All right. So we want to display our number, right? So let's first put our number here. Always remember, if you just do this, it's just going to show number as it's plain text. So instead, we have to put it into our curly brackets. All right, so this is going to show our number as 0, but now we want to write the actual function that updates it. So let's create a button here. All right, and within our button, let's do something called onClick. So this is also something that's kind of like unique to React, but there's tons of little functions you can use within here. There's like onClick, onChange, on like mouse over. I think these are things that you can like search up as well if you need to use them for specific cases. Most of the time, onClick is like the most basic one. All right, so inside this onClick, we kind of need to like, oh, my internet is unstable, it says. Okay, let me know if I ever freeze. Okay, but anyway, so inside this function, we kind of want to create a function that calls on set number. So when we click on it, basically it's going to call a function that takes set number and increases our number by 1. Okay, does that make sense so far? Okay, someone asked the question, can you give an example of when we would want to use state and prop? Yeah, so anytime you're like passing something down, like for example, if it's here, this is what prop is basically. So this is when you'll be using props. When you're using state, this is when you want to change something within your function. So in this case, we want to change, our counter is taking care of all the logic behind changing the number within our function. So that's when we'd be using state instead of prop. Does that answer your question? Okay, nice. And something else, we would also have to create like a our actual description within the button. So this is HTML again. Yeah, so that's should be the logic straight for increasing the number. Now we want to display it, right? So displaying it, we actually haven't called on it yet. So that's when we have to go back to our app.js and import it. So let's just import it right below our nav bar. And then, okay. All right, so it looks kind of ugly, but right now we're just doing our logic. So hopefully it should be okay. But yeah, if you click on the button, it will increase your number. Nice. Okay, let's also, just so we can have like a comprehensive button, let's also do a decrease number. So it would be like that. Something else that I want to mention is you can actually, instead of putting this within an arrow function, if you want to, you can also create like a separate function out here. So let me do this just for like the decrease button. So let's say we create another arrow function, and instead of putting that, we can just do this. And then inside of here, instead, we can actually just call decrease. So there's several ways to write things inside React. So that's just like one way. Yeah, and it works. In which you can change things up. Something else that I think is always neat to know, like this always confused me back when I was first learning. Like for example, you can actually create a arrow function here and then call this like that. So the purpose of why I'm showing the differences is that if you don't create an arrow function, then you don't need the parentheses. But if you do create an arrow function, you need the parentheses. That's just like a distinction of how like functions work. Yeah, just thought that would be something neat to mention. But yeah, that is pretty much it for our counter. Like it works totally fine now. Yeah, do you have any questions so far? And something I also want to mention is that if you actually think about it, you could have done this with JavaScript. Like if you were to put your button into an HTML file and then did like a .get element ID, and then inside that do like click and then do like number +1, that would have worked as well. But if you think about it, that is like really, really like inefficient because that takes like 2 different files. It also can get super, super messy if you have so many things within your code. So this is just a nicer way to write things, and this is the standard way to write things. So you don't need to use like things like select query or query select all anymore, because now all of our DOM is virtual. That's the power of React. Okay, and we have a question that says, what does the 0 and use state 0 do? So this is the initial value it's set to. So I'm not sure if it'll reset actually. Let me see. Okay, it does reset. So if you see, it actually starts off at 0. So that's kind of like the first value you want it to be. Is usually 0. It's usually like false. It's usually an empty string. It's usually like the most like basic of your type. That's usually the most standard. Yeah, and that is actually pretty much it for our lesson. So we actually learned so much today, like very basic of everything. I try to cover everything from like the actual commands you use to like the anatomy of your app. Like the file structure, as well as props, states, kind of just like what package.json does, what your node modules do. Yeah, just in general, the basic gist of how a React works. It's separated into components. So yeah, we learned so much today, but like there's so much more to learn with React. It's definitely something like really, really complex. So within our next lesson, we're gonna like try to give like a more comprehensive demo of like an actual way you can use it instead of just like a counter, which is like very, very basic. But yeah, I think this is good for today. Do you guys have any other questions? And today we don't have attendance, so I think that's pretty much it. You guys can go if you don't have any questions. Yeah, no problem. Do you always have to put the functions in divs? So the actual functions themselves don't need to be in divs, but whatever is in your return needs to be in a div. Yeah, so if you were to do like let's go back to our nav bar. But if you were to do something like X out here, this is going to give you an error. So always make sure to put it within your div.
Thank you, Kim.
No problem. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
I had a question, but it was about like it's not really like about the actual lesson, but it's about the project. When I was trying to like make my website, I kind of ended up making different pages. Like I didn't realize it was like one page that we were making. So I like actually made a nav bar and I like made it to go to each page. And then I was kind of making it wait, I have 2 questions actually. My first question is that
yeah, I'm gonna pause the recording so I can